Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. Today, why do activists continue to persevere when the problems at hand are so large? And what happens after the shouting, the protesting, and things seem to have evolved only an inch or not at all? Paul Loeb, author of the book, The Impossible Will Take a Little While, Perseverance and Hope in Troubled Times, has just released an updated version of that book, now in its 22nd printing. It features motivational memoirs, essays, and poems from all sorts of activists, including Arundhati Roy, Eduardo Galeano, Bill Moyers, and Terry Tempest, all, like Loeb, former Grit TV guests. That gives us a chance to revisit some of those interviews and to welcome Paul Loeb back to the show. Hi, Paul. Glad to have you.
Very glad to be back here.
22 printings. It's kind of incredible. Why do you think this book's so popular, Paul?
Well, I think The Impossible Will Take a Little While is popular because anybody who works for change struggles with the question of whether it's going to matter. And you win a victory, and then that victory seems to get rolled back, or you just throw your heart into a cause, and the cause doesn't prevail. And if you want to do it over time, and one of the arguments I make is that only doing it over time will actually change things, you're going to hit the wall, and you're going to hit the wall later on, you're going to hit the wall later on. And so people were, I remember when it first came out, it was the 2004 election, and people would email me and say, you know, I'm ready to jump off a bridge, and this book saved me. And I think this is probably hyperbole, but you know, I tried to stop this war, and it didn't happen. And
you know, I remember that was a bad year, 2004. I was on the air at Air America Radio the night of the election, and I don't know about jump off a bridge, but there were a lot of people talking about moving to Canada. How do you think things have changed since that year?
It's been interesting because I've watched the sort of cycle of lifted hopes of a lot of people and frustrated hopes. I mean, a lot of people, I mean, the book certainly speaks across party lines, but a lot of people vested huge amounts of hope in Obama. I mean, if you remember, there was the brand. It was the Shepard Fairey iconic image of Obama branded as he's Mr. Hope. And of course, to me, that's, I mean, it may have been good campaign politics, but in terms of people watching it, to identify your hope with any particular leader, whoever it happens to be, is problematic. And so when suddenly the millennium didn't occur, and you know, you could argue the causes of that, but a whole lot of people felt disappointed, like, I tried this, it didn't work, I'm going home. And of course, if you're working for change, and this is the lesson of every single person in this book, is they're inevitably going to hit walls. Yeah. So, you know, think of Mandela, 27 years in a South African prison. And you're told, you're going to die here, you're going to rot here, give up. And so you manage to, the prisoners were denied newspapers. And as a way of isolating them, you see the guard who's wrapped his sandwich in a newspaper, they retrieve it from the trash can and smuggle it under their shirt, and they could only toilet paper is the only paper they had, so some coded little script, they pass the headliner story that's going to give them hope, cell to cell, or they're breaking rocks and start whistling a freedom song. You look at that and you think, okay, you persevere by recognizing that there's others along with you.
So where do you come into this? I mean, is this your story that you got discouraged at some point many years ago?
Well, I don't know that I wouldn't say that I hit this sort of period of discouragement, you know, at this peak point in my life, and then had to keep going. But what I would say is, in all the work that I do, like any other work for change, there are moments of frustration, inevitably. And, you know, you hit something and you just figure out how you're going to keep going. I run a project to get students, in this national nonpartisan project, to get students involved in elections. And at one point, a key staffer had just slammed with health stuff, and we had to deal with that. You know, how do you, very practical issue, but how do you deal with it? Or the key funder you've courted for, you know, for years just goes away, leaves the Ford Foundation, you got to start all over again. And these kinds of things, I mean, when a project is hanging on this, you know this as well, you know, you're just demoralized. And then you sort of say, okay, well, I'm going to go for, in my case, I'm going to go for a run. I'm going to think about the importance of the work that we do. I'm going to talk to some friends so that I have community. And then I'm going to keep going.
Yeah. To what extent do you think we are up against a cultural problem? It's hard to think of a society that is more capitalist, more individualist, more focused on a certain kind of tangible, immediate accomplishment or acquisition in the present, ideally yesterday.
It's short term, and then add in the technology even. And we wanted yesterday, we wanted to load immediately.
Are we different from other parts of the world in that respect?
I'm not certain, but I think that probably our approach has proliferated. I mean, not only from us, that would be inaccurate, but that it's certainly set a tone. I mean, partly because America came out of World War II as a dominant industrial power. So it's sort of set a tone for much of the world that adopted it more or less, but that said, if you compete in this way, this is what you have to do. And I think it bleeds over to politics and to social change and to saying, all right, look, we want results. We want them now. Nurturing something for the long haul. Building a relationship, bringing somebody new to involvement. I mean, one of the interesting things that I found with The Impossible will take a little while is that with Václav Havel actually sort of described it best, is he described the process where they were fighting to get some political prisoners freed. And they didn't free them, and he's reflecting about 7 years later, he said, we didn't free them, didn't succeed. But we kept them going with a sense of community, and we also kept them going by bringing in new people. Yeah. And the new people kept speaking out. And so it's the same way that one of my favorite sections is the story about Mary Piper, who's a best-selling friend, a longtime friend of mine, best-selling psychology author, who's always had very strong values, but I wouldn't say that her temperament is an organizer and activist. And the Keystone Pipeline is coming right near where she lives in Nebraska. She doesn't know what to do, so she does this very radical action of holding a potluck. 3 or 4 people. They gather together. They still don't know what to do after, but they've had some good food. They've had the community. They know that they're going to have another one. Then it's 10 or 11. They get this rock-rigged Republican rancher named Randy Thompson, whose ranch is directly in the way of the pipeline, who says, I will not be bullied. They're not going to, this is my family's land, it's not Canada's land. They do life-size cutouts of him, he looks like John Wayne, saying, I will stand with Randy. And there's a moment where there's a University of Nebraska football team, and of course TransCanada's bought up every land and every elected official, every PR firm, every ad, and so they've got the ad on the Jumbotron. And 80,000 people in the stadium, and boos erupt. And suddenly something has changed.
You quote Marge Piercy, a fantastic poem that reminds us of the perils of kind of the celebrity culture in which she lives, because she makes the point, the work of the world is as common as mud. How many Americans want to do work that's as common as mud? That's part of our problem, I think. It
is. Tony Kushner says the same thing in his piece. He says, sometimes the work is glam and you're right on the moment, and a lot of times it's unheralded. And it's the same thing as the piece I write on Rosa Parks, where if you say the key moment is just the bus, where's the key moment, the 12 years with the NAACP, where she's the secretary doing the work of mud, the unglamorous, unheralded work. You got to do that, or else nothing happens.
We'll talk a bit about the elements that you've identified, because that's one of them.
Right.
Preparation, training, education. In her
Persistence.
case, years of work doing work against violence against women that's only recently been recognized and acknowledged. But there are some other factors too.
So to me, the elements in general, so it's having the supportive community, it's persistence, it's not discounting our victories. That's really important. So recently there was a kind of epical, I would say epical and yet in some ways insufficient move by President Obama to regulate coal plant pollution. Yeah. I mean, further leap than anybody has ever done, and probably still not what we ultimately need to reverse climate change. And you could look at one way or the other, and I saw a lot of people celebrating it, which was great, and I also saw some people discounting it and saying, I'm not pointing out, which is fine, that it still needs to go farther. That's completely appropriate, but sort of saying, well, it's not enough.
So it's important to say well, we got something.
We got
and
something.
We want more.
Yeah. Or I have a wonderful piece by Dan Savage on just looking at the gay rights movement and just saying
it gets better guy.
The It Gets Better guy. 30, 40 years ago, much less 500 years ago, and look, where it was, and the idea that you could have a U.S. Supreme Court justice conducting a gay marriage in Washington, D.C., absolutely unthinkable. And yet people, the thing is, I've seen people exceptionalize that and say, it's good, it's progress, but that's not the real issues, and it doesn't give me hope.
Where does the question of consensus or coalition come in? What have you learned? Because that's a great example where both of the examples you just gave include spectra maybe, of opinion, where you had some people who were really pushing for the most radical change, and then others more in the middle. You don't get one without the other, it seems to me. And yet we also have a society that tends to, because we're all competing for funding dollars and whatever.
We have the silver bullet that will slay everybody.
Exactly. We tend to say our way is the only and the most important way. Any advice for people in that situation?
Well, I think the advice is to recognize, I always use the phrase of ecology of change. I look at, in the project on getting the students involved, I say, there's an ecology of youth participation. We do some pieces, some other places do some other pieces, they fit together, and if they all work, you have a lot of people participating who wouldn't otherwise. And it's true with all of these kinds of things. And to me, one of the, I think the Occupy movement was, had some huge and continuing ripple effects from de Blasio's election in New York to the $15 an hour minimum wage recently passed in my home city of Seattle. It's not to say it didn't have an impact, because it did, but did it limit itself by saying we have the solution and being a little bit contemptuous of everybody else working before? My view, profoundly so, and that was a tragedy.
We're playing a few clips from Grit TV over the years featuring some of the folks in Paul Loeb's book, The Impossible Takes a Little While.
There's been this seesaw battle between democracy, so that all of us share in the promise, and property and wealth, which is designed to prevent other people from encroaching on the privileges of wealth. Democracy is a brake on the greed and power that human beings, liberals and conservatives, if they get power and wealth, can exploit. Democracy is a brake on capital, because capital is like fire. It can be a good friend or a bad master.
If you look at what this government is doing in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, and now all that's spilling over into Kashmir and India, it's expanded the war. It's made it worse, but it's smoke and mirrors. There's a lot of clever talk, so people are confused by it. But in fact, if you were to visit Pakistan or Afghanistan, I don't think that the American government has any idea what it's in for and what it's doing and what it's trying to do. It's such a completely crazy mess. And to think that you can solve it militarily is the most lunatic idea I've ever heard. When you don't even understand that Taliban is not 17 or 17,000 people, it's an ideology, and you can't fire bullets at an ideology.
We know exactly how many invaders were killed in the war, in Iraq war, exactly the number. But we have no ideas about the invaded killed. There are so many figures, absolutely different, diverse, thousands. We only know that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of invaded killed in a war which was born from a lie, and lying continues to exist. But this is racism.
We don't know how to deal with circles, spirals. We only know hierarchies. And what I love about Occupy Wall Street is that it's asking us to use a different kind of model.
Let me come back to you, Paul, and ask you about one of the fellows. We've lost a few in this year, but one who makes an appearance in your book, albeit brief, who passed away this year, and that was Vincent Harding.
Yeah.
Did you know him?
I did. I remember it was was at the U.S. Social Forum in Detroit. We were hanging out together, and this is the person who helped write a lot of Martin Luther King's Vietnam speech. I always used his metaphor of there is a river. And he talks about a river. It's the title of one of his books on the civil rights movement. He's a historian and theologian, and he talks about a river of social justice involvement going back to the biblical prophets, because he's a theologian. And everybody who participates in social change is part of that river. And if you broaden that river, it then becomes, in the phrase that King borrowed from the book of Amos, a mighty stream, and enough to create change. And I just thought it was such a powerful metaphor. And you meet him in person, he's just totally unpretentious, warm, funny. He was really interested in the attempts to grow local food in Detroit and convinced me to come to one of the workshops on that. Yeah, wonderful human being.
I have to push back on hope for 1 second.
Sure, sure.
I was reading a marvelous book by Lewis Mumford, of which there are many.
Of which there are many.
I think
Yes.
it's Technics and Civilization.
Right.
He
Maybe my favorite.
diatribes against hope.
Right.
He says hope is what those in power give us to believe in because they don't want to give us the reality today that we need.
Right. It depends on your definition of hope. So there was a famous song of the Wobblies, you'll get pie in the sky when you die. That's a lie. Now, my version of hope is a different version of hope, and Václav Havel talks about it. He distinguishes optimism and hope. Optimism is the belief that things will turn out as you want them to. And I think that that is a trap, because you get roller coastered, or you say, I hope somebody will do this. I hope somebody will take care of global warming. That would be great. The hope that I like is, Jim Wallace of Sojourners, who's in the book, says, hope is believing in the evidence, acting on it, and then watching the evidence change. So it's that it propels you to act. Havel talks about it as that force that makes you believe that it's worthwhile to persevere in your convictions, even when everything is stacked against you. I think to me that's a necessary driving force for change. But it's true, if you passively wait. There's a wonderful piece by a friend of mine called The Inevitability Trap. It's on climate change. And he says, well, you can say it's out of our hands. You can say, gee, we had a moment when we could have solved it, but now it's too late. We'll just wait for civilization to collapse. Or you can say it's up to somebody. The decisions people make are going to be, in fact, the ones that determine the outcome. We don't know the outcome. Therefore, for all of us, we have to act. And that's the definition of hope that I embrace.
What are you working on next?
Mostly on trying to get students to participate in the elections. That's my immediate task. I mean, it's just, there's a lot of cynicism out there. They don't think that their voice matters. And part of what I want to say to them is, it goes back to the ecology of social change, which is, have your voice during the elections, have your voice between the elections, hold the people's feet to the fire, whoever you're voting for, hold them to the fire, follow out on your beliefs, and maybe this is the thread between my project and the book, is keep on persisting in it.
The Impossible will take a little while now, and it's 20-second printing. We'll put a link on our website for how you can get a copy. Paul, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Great to have you.